Добрый вечер, дорогие коллеги. Я очень рада сегодня представить, я думаю, все знакомы, нашего нового коллегу на факультете Нари Шелекпаева. И мне кажется, Нари просто воплощение гражданина мира. У нас на факультете никогда не работал человек, который получил бы столько разных образований в разных странах. И мне кажется, это расширяет нашу географию и возможности, в первую очередь, наших студентов и аспирантов получить новые знания и соприкоснуться с очень разными академическими культурами. И Нари сегодня представляет свое исследование о столицах и столичном городе. Я думаю, что студенты, которые посещают его курс, знают об этом чуть больше, чем мы, преподаватели, которые будем слушать Нари впервые. Нари, пожалуйста.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое за это представление. Я не знаю, вообще стоит ли использовать микрофон или... Я начну, да, и потом... Так меня слышно, да, я думаю? Сначала несколько таких дисклеймеров, а реплик вводных, да. Во-первых, я вел это исследование на английском, поэтому мне удобней его представлять на английском, но дискуссия, все вопросы могут адресоваться либо на русском, либо на английском, как вам удобно. Во-первых. Во-вторых, этот проект, он длился несколько лет, и так случилось, что я его представлял в разных местах, но по кусочкам, и его пришло очень трудно собрать в один какой-то поэтому я сейчас пытаюсь просто перерабатывать свою диссертацию в книгу, и, соответственно, у меня тоже много концептуальных задач и практических задач, что оставить, что включить. И поэтому ваша критика, ваши вопросы, они будут очень полезны, так что не колеблйтесь или не колебайтесь. В общем, go ahead, задавайте все вопросы, если у вас есть какая-то критика, сомнения и так далее. Кстати, со студентами мы еще не дошли до столиц, поэтому для тех, кто слушает, может, мой курс по Urban History, будет тоже полезно, как это будет у вас как аперитив, да, такой перед следующей неделей, да, или через 2 недели. Следующей неделе, по-моему, да, окей. Ну все, тогда поехали, да. Еще третий. У меня есть очень такая тенденция забывать слайды. Я могу забыть их показывать, поэтому если я долго не показываю слайды, вы мне напоминайте, потому что я могу про них забыть просто. И если со светлым, видно ли, может быть, в принципе, можно как-то отрегулировать и какой-то из этих плафонов выключить. So, this research has its roots in events that occurred about a quarter of a century ago. On the evening of July 6, 1994, at the end of the evening news, the broadcaster unexpectedly announced that my native country, Kazakhstan, would have a new capital city. The relocation initiative came from the president, who had pushed the parliament to approve it. In the days that followed, everyone discussed the issue. Resentment was a common feeling. The economy was crumbling and many people could barely make both ends meet, so a huge project such as building a new capital city would simply ruin the country, they said. What was to be done with the old capital, Almaty, was unclear as well. For so many resources had been invested in it over the past few decades that taking its status away seemed irrational, not to say the least. After that, for a couple of years, not much was heard about the new capital city, so just silence, no discussion. Passion subsided gradually. People forgot about the controversial proposal and recalled it only to point out that the initiative had come to naught and that the authorities had been able to backpedal thanks to popular pressure. Then, suddenly, in mid-1996, the media started to talk about the relocation again, and on a massive scale. Official meetings were held in Astana, and the television. Astana at the time wasn't called Astana, it was called, the Kazakhstan's capital changed its name several times. So it was called Akmola, I think, at the time, 1996. The television showed the construction sites everywhere in that city. Soon, one of them you can see on the board, right? Soon the government officially announced that its headquarters would move from Almaty to Astana in 1998 at the latest. And indeed, the new capital city was inaugurated in June of 1998. The relocation became the key event in the post-Soviet history of Kazakhstan. It had vast demographic and economic consequences and affected the life of several generations of Kazakhstanis. With my generation, my mom is here, her generation, so there was a big amount of people affected. What is going next? And this is the same landscape that you see 10, 15 years later. The construction of Astana, which spent over a decade, occurred before my eyes. I saw skyscrapers emerging from the steppe and a small shabby town being transformed into a potent city. And I also saw how discontent and skepticism gradually gave way to acceptance and pride in such a brave project. Each year, thousands of people moved to Astana, and the city appeared to possess inexhaustible resources to provide everyone with work and ultimately improve people's lives. But I have also seen how the new city gradually absorbed the old one, and how the new elite and their activities gradually marginalized the pre-capital identity of Astana and its native dwellers. Moreover, the development of Astana has sucked money and brain power from the rest of the country. Without a doubt, Astana provoked thoughts not only about the goals of the state pursued as it changed its seat of government, but also about who had paid for this all, literally and figuratively. These questions impelled me in turn to look at similar examples in other epochs and polities. I was struck to realize how many of them had created new capital cities and how this has been an ongoing historical phenomenon inherited from previous epochs. And St. Petersburg is probably a nice place to discuss this, right? So, inherited from previous epochs, not invented by contemporary nation states. But if creating new landscapes of power occurred in many states throughout their history, did those processes have something that made them discernibly similar? And if so, what would be the most fruitful approach to analyze that sameness without denying the specificities of each case, right? For the fact that new capital cities constantly emerge has been an ongoing historical process, as I just said. Nevertheless, is there anything that makes this process sought after or unavoidable, in which mechanisms enable the new founded or existing cities to become effective sites of government? Equally important is the question on how to shed light on the ways the states and capital cities co-construct or condition each other's existence, or make each other visible and recognizable, because one is often used as a metonymy or a proxy for the other, right? So before going to details of my research, it might be useful to look on the notion of capital city and the way it has been employed in recent historiography. If defining what a city is seems to be an unmanageable task due to the entity's irreducible complexity, the task of defining a capital city is generally deemed to be unproblematically unanimous. Most authors are in agreement that a capital city is by definition, the seat of government. This is the key feature by default. This being said, not only is it the case that some capital cities are not seats of government, probably the most well-known case is Amsterdam, right? Because it's written in the constitution of the Netherlands that Amsterdam is mandated to be the capital city, but it is not, because the official departments and the government is located at The Hague, right? But other features of such cities, of capitals, like size, income, demography, are so divergent that associating any of them with general cases would make us question whether the exception, as they say, simply proves the rule, or only proves the rule, right? So we would see later an example of, let's see, this one. Classifying capital cities into type is a helpless exercise as well. Selection criteria at a certain point become Procrustean to the point that the disadvantages of chaos are preferable to the merits of organization. In collective imaginations, capital cities are large and mighty entities, a concentration of professional activities, of leisure, of culture, place from which decision makers pull the invisible strings that extend over countries and continents. But are all capital cities large and mighty? Apparently not. For the here is the list of a few capital cities with the income, the GDP income, and you see that there is a huge variety in the so there isn't a there is a conclusion we can draw based on this. For instance, so the GDP of Tokyo, for instance, exceeds almost 100 times that of Kinshasa, right? Do capital cities always have a specific form or an imposing appearance? And taking Brasília as an example, a city which is explicitly designed as the seat of government, one would reply affirmatively, right? One would say yes, because for Brasília, you see it on your on your left. So it's a city which was specifically designed as a capital city. You have very clear and coherent plan. So you have a very clear idea of what is central, what is less important, and what areas of the city correspond to which function, right? And on the right you have Banjul, and Banjul is a does anyone here know Banjul? Banjul is a very small town. It's the capital city of Gambia. And it doesn't really have traces of capital planning. It's a very ad hoc city, and if you compare the two, you would not necessarily understand that those cities are anything in common, but they do. But the coherence of design is also not the prominent feature, right? Although we can draw on some examples to prove the former. So, do capital cities move and how often? Again, no specific answer is possible. Many of them did move in the past for various reasons, while many others have remained in the same place for centuries. This being said, the stability of a capital city's location rarely signified an unchanging and unmoving landscape within a largely stable site. Most capital cities have transformed themselves remarkably over centuries. St. Petersburg would be a great example for this. If you walk, you see a distinct layer of 18th century, then you have a distinct layer of 19th century, then the 20th one, a bit less. And then you see contemporary architecture as well, or urban planning, right? Gazprom Tower or Nova Zealandia, right? These are more recent examples. Well, Nova Zealandia, it has been redesigned, reappropriated, but still, yeah, it's something new in the perception or in the way it's conceived. So, what's next here? When one decides to address the recent literature in a search for answers to the aforementioned questions, one faces a conundrum. It is unclear what precisely constitutes the historiography of capital cities. First, many works have been dedicated to cities that were capitals, but the scope of these works has not necessarily been to explore the capital aspect of their history. Second, most recent studies which addressed capitals as such did not focus explicitly on the issues related to their historical scope, such as their constantly evolving relation with or within various political entities as both medium and message. Third, the discipline of history never had a field of study devoted to the specific analysis of capital cities, nor did it possess a theory that explained their role in the modern war period. This led to a situation in which historians addressed a wide range of topics related to individual capitals without considering them a distinct spatio-temporal phenomenon. As a result, capital cities remain, as mentioned Scott Campbell about 20 years ago, I quote, an easily defined but poorly understood class of cities, end of quote. Given the aforementioned context, I suggest two things. First of all, instead of attempting to define what capital cities are or are not based on their current situation, it seems more productive to employ the notion of capitality, which you see on board, or what I define as a capacity of a given city to be or to become the seat of government, the actual seat of government. This approach might help to analyze current capitals and the way they have been constructed historically. The term capitality is inspired by the French term capitalité, employed by Patrick Boucheron, Denis Mangeot, and Pierre Monet in the article that had focused on medieval capital cities. While the designation and status of capital cities in pre-modern and modern period are quite different processes, capitality is nevertheless useful to analyze capital cities as a process versus an outcome, right? So because we are interested, at least I'm interested in processes more than the results. The term may thus be useful when it comes to seeing working capital cities based on more than an unstructured abundance of dissonant data pertaining to their current form and content. Instead, one can use the term to inquire more successfully into the ways by which today's actual capitals came into existence, as well as the very notion of a capital city has been constructed in specific circumstances. Well, then a few. Some of you probably read the short text as announcement to this conference. So a few words should be said on the comparative approach that I have been employing so far, adopting so far. While the general virtue of comparison is that it allows to change a conventional perspective on a case by incorporating the epistemological and practical experiences from other cases, recent historiography has drawn attention to how the comparative approach may be hobbled by superfluous reliance on causal explanations and an unwarranted tendency to schematize. Given this, I should clarify that the intention of my research is not simply to set my case studies side by side. By far, this is not my intention. Rather, I seek to elaborate, drawing on the cases of Brasília, Astana, and Ottawa, a working analytical framework that may help one to grasp the commonly held dynamics that enabled contemporary capital cities to take shape. By contemporary, I mean since the mid-19th century, let's say. Now you probably became sufficiently curious and warmed up to learn more about the case studies and to discover what would be the connection between the object of this research and the aforementioned framework or frameworks of investigation. To demonstrate how the two work together, I will briefly talk about the history of each of my case studies, further develop on their common or dissimilar features and the way a capitality can be analyzed through the example that they might provide. Ottawa, this is Ottawa in approximately mid-19th century, about 1850s. So Ottawa is the oldest case, so let's talk about it at first place. Historically, the site where Ottawa is now located has for centuries been home for the Algonquin people. Algonquin is one of the First Nations in Canada. Algonquins and other indigenous nations used territories in and near what is currently Ottawa as a sacred site for rites and burials. The European settlers arrived in Ottawa in the early 19th century. Well, of course, they started to arrive much earlier, but the massive arrival, let's say, happened in the mid-19th century, in the early 19th century, to exploit the key natural resource in the area, which was lumber. In 1857, Ottawa had participated in an open call to host the seat of Canadian government. One should bear in mind that Canada, the province of Canada in the mid-19th century was much smaller than it is today, right? It was a very, very small territory, actually. So you have the Great Lakes, right? So Canada was what you see to the northeast from the Great Lakes and the basin of the St. Lawrence River. And that was Canada actually. So there was no Vancouver, there was no Rockies, no Canada West. So only this part, and there was no Canada East, which is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the part which we now see on the east. So, and there was an open call for hosting the capital city, the seat of government of Canada, in which 5 cities participated: Ville de Québec, Quebec City, Montreal, Ottawa in the middle, Toronto, and Kingston. And there was a lot of intrigues and a lot of mess, and finally the Parliament of Canada could not decide on the issue, and the Queen Victoria was appointed to make a decision, and the Queen Victoria took a very unexpected decision to choose Ottawa as a capital city, and no one expected this, because Ottawa didn't have such an important lobby, and it was actually a very controversial situation, but it was done in this way. And the Queen's choice had never received any formal approval from the Algonquin or any other Indigenous nation in Canada. This has now been a question of a huge controversy, because the natives, they claim, they come to the Parliament and they say, your capital city, the capital city of Canada, stands in a place which doesn't belong to you. So it's an ongoing controversy, actually. So this being said, in 1867, when Canada became a dominion, the status of Ottawa was confirmed, and since that time the town has experienced several periods of major demographic and territorial expansion. So Ottawa started to grow very, very quickly since 1867. So here we see, this is a lithograph from exactly 1863, when the new Parliament buildings have just been erected, obviously in a neo-Gothic, Victorian neo-Gothic style, which was tremendously fashionable in that period. So you can see that the city is quite small. So you essentially have the Parliament buildings, which throne over the city. You have a really small church on that side, and that actually was it. So it was really small, and the Parliament was something that a landmark, by far the most important landmark in that part of the region. And this is a representation from the late 19th century already. It's 1895, and we see that the territory, the size of the city has already. The city grew extensively, and Canada actually lived a period of very strong economic boom in the late 19th century. So since the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s were a period of very prosperity in Canada. So this Ottawa also grew. This was federal capital. The capital of Dominion, by that time. But this, I found this representation in the national, in Washington, in the archives of the US. And this map is interesting because actually you see that the power that the building of the Parliament is really downplayed. So it doesn't take a prominent role. So what is most important here is the commerce and the business and the urban activities. So the identity of the city, which becomes a hub for let's say for urban life, for commerce, it becomes more important even than the governmental features of Ottawa. This is quite in the 19th century already. In the late 19th century, we face a negotiation of various facets of Ottawa, and this is the plan of Ottawa of the mid-20th century. This is already mid-20th century. This is a plan by Jacques Rébert, who was invited by Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister at that time, who came from France, to draw a new modernist plan for Ottawa, which actually it was the first comprehensive master plan for the city. And you see already a lot of what we take it critically at this moment, but it was then very, very modern, very new. And some drastic solutions have been proposed, which were realized, unfortunately. For instance, Rébert suggested to relocate the railway station to the periphery, which is early located like close to the parliament. And we see the green belt, the suggestion for the green belt. And one of the major sort of conceptual suggestions was to unite the two parts of Ottawa, because here it's Ontario, and then the upper side is Quebec. And then Weber thought that the merge of two parts would lessen the contradictions between the Francophone and the Anglophone parts of Canada. So that was a very kind of wise suggestion. And given the context that would arrive in the 1960s and 1970s, it was a wise suggestion, definitely. So this actually plan was realized to a major extent, despite all its controversies. And this is Ottawa, like more or less how it looks nowadays. So we are fine with time, absolutely. The territory where Astana is now located, has been the home for many centuries to a group of Argan nations who historically inhabited the central and northern territories of contemporary Kazakhstan. By the early 19th century, Argans were incorporated into the Russian Empire, and what is now Astana was founded as a fortress in the late 1830s. So we're talking about the same, more or less the same period as we would as I just mentioned for Canada. By 1860, the growing site, which hosted one of the largest marketplaces in northern Central Asia, was granted the status of town. This is how Astana, then it wasn't called Astana, it was called Akmolensk, looked in the late 19th, early 20th century. By 1860, the growing site, by the early 20th century, the relocation of European settlers to Kazakhstan effectively reduced the population of the Kazakhs compared to the immigrants. In the 1950s, the Soviet government decided to transform Akmolensk and its surrounding areas into an agricultural region. You must have certainly heard about Целина, освоение целинных земель. Mikhail Markovich, you are falling asleep. Wake up. No? You're okay?
Very much interested.
Okay. Since 1998, when Astana was inaugurated as a new capital, probably I'll just speak louder. Everyone wakes up. So, when Astana was inaugurated as a new capital of Kazakhstan, the city has grown about 6 times, and its population now is more than 1 million people. So, it was in 1994, Astana had less than 200,000 people. Now it's about 1,300,000. So it's 5-6 times at least, and then we have illegal sort of migrants who are not registered. So we also have to consider them. Among the 3 cases, Brasilia had physically had the shorter lifespan. Now we jump to Brasília. Its intellectual project, the intellectual project of Brasilia, however, is at least as old as Ottawa and Astana. While Ottawa and Astana had crystallized as artifacts of the Russian Empire's expansion into Central Asia and British Empire's expansion into North America, Brasilia was, for most of the 19th century, a proxy for internal colonization of the Portuguese colonial settlers in South America. There had been several attempts to relocate the capital city from Rio de Janeiro to the hinterland since the late 19th century, which was until then mostly inhabited by the Aboriginal nations of Brazil. All these attempts, however, were unsuccessful due to a lack of funds, the resistance of the southern coastal regions, and an unclear vision as to where exactly the new capital city should be located. So this is the map of. Actually, I was when I lived in Brazil, I spent several months in Brazil, in various places in Brasília and in Rio, and I was very curious to explore what kind of indigenous nations actually inhabit now Brazil and in the region, in the around the capital city, and the previous traces in history. And it's been a very it's not easy to get this information actually. Some maps exist like this one, but it's not precise at all. The resistance of southern regions, which I just mentioned, was obviously came here. Rio de Janeiro didn't want to lose the status of capital city. São Paulo was the richest economic economic hub. Then we have three most southern regions here, Rio Grande do Sul, then we have Santa Catarina and Paraná. These five were very stubbornly anti-Brasilia until 1950s. The favorable conditions for the removal were reached in the 1950s when the populist government of Juscelino Kubitschek de Oliveira realized that the relocation could be used as a symbol, both locally and internationally, of the country's accelerated modernization. In 1956, Juscelino Kubitschek thus undertook what would later be considered as the most audacious project in modern Brazilian history, the relocation of the capital city from Rio de Janeiro to the hinterland, to Brasília. After Brasília was inaugurated in 1960, Kubitschek did his best to present the new capital city as the symbol of progress and hopes for a brighter future in his country. Yet the problems that Brasília promised to solve, Brasília as a city promised to solve, unbalanced regional development, political instability, and social inequalities, remained largely unimproved and remain so today. We can say that safely. Today, Brasília is a well-planned and well-maintained city with 600,000 inhabitants, while the surroundings are inhabited by chaotic and unplanned agglomeration of several million people. This is a very, actually there have been a lot of, even I wrote about it extensively, that the most sort of clear and established view in historiography is that the utopian promise of this master plan didn't realize because the workers who worked on the construction of Brasília were relocated after it was inaugurated somewhere. So Brasília is actually is a very nice place, but it's surrounded by chaotic agglomeration. And here you have 600,000 people, and then the rest is about like millions of people who live like in very sometimes very problematic conditions. But another issue is actually what I found in the archive of Lúcio Costa, for instance, is that the inequalities which are so much which are analyzed, let's say, teleologically, were already in the plan, were already in the concepts, because the Lúcio Costa he prepared the plans for let's say for residential blocks, and when he prepared the plans for residential blocks, he conceived different entrances for maids and for landlords. So the masters come from a certain entrance, and then the servants and the maids from a different one. So the social distinction and the class distinction was already in the concept. And then you have the golf. The area for the golf is here. For instance, you can see it. You can see it in the. This is the earliest drawing, the earliest proposal by Lúcio Costa for Brasília. And when you conceive an egalitarian city, you wouldn't necessarily put the golf club in it, right? Or you would, I don't know. It's a question of probably also the socio-economic context of the 1950s. So through this summary, you might notice that Astana, Brasília, and Ottawa were not only created or co-created by the agents of British, Russian, and Portuguese/Brazilian empires, but also served as instruments of territorial expansion for their colonial settlers. It is precisely this feature in the history of Ottawa, Brasília, and Astana that I used as a basis for my comparative analysis. Another aspect which my research aspired to illuminate is the continuity between the foundation and the early existence of the three capital cities under colonial rule and their trajectory as capitals under self-governed states or regimes. Brazil, Canada, and Kazakhstan gained autonomy from their former empires in a gradual and revolutionless fashion, and their elites merely adjusted the existing imperial practices to the changing political circumstances. I therefore tend to regard the fabrication of the three capitals as an example of a co-construction between imperial and national agencies, rather than approaching the two as separate processes. Such an approach might enable one to productively question. I think it enabled me to productively question the national perspectives regarding each case on the one hand. On the other hand, such an approach allows one to question the frontiers between what is labeled as colonial and imperial in the current literatures. It might be useful to remind that in recent years the notion of empire had been productively rediscovered and redeployed for various types of historical inquiry. This, in turn, has led to an epistemological situation where once clear concept-based and operational divisions between empires and nation states have gradually become blurred and problematic. As Michael and Filiu noted a few years ago in History and Theory journal, I quote, "The very notion of empire has shifted in balance from the rather negative one associated with colonialism and imperialism in the 20th century to one in which it serves as an antidote to all that is unsatisfying about the nation-state form that supersedes empire across the globe in the course of the 20th century." End of quote. Don't have time to develop this on this point, but it can be developed definitely. However, the imperial term did not only emerge from a disappointment with nation states, right, as we know, or a desire to problematize their genealogy. The recent interest in the notion of empires as a category of analysis and practice is also due to the fact that some historians gradually came to believe that empires and nation states do not necessarily teleologically condition one another, although such scenario is not completely excluded, right? But evolve together, often in an entangled fashion. In any case, nation states cannot be fully grasped without situating them in the context of imperialism and questioning the former through the latter. So, in this sense, my three capital cities are both curious and useful objects of investigation, as they are located historically in a way that allows to observe and analyze both the imperial and post-imperial agency related to their construction and legitimation at various levels, be it municipal, national, and international. For not only was the intellectual... okay, this is the... there is another picture of Brasilia, which is quite interesting. When Brasilia just started to be built, it's about 1960. For not only was the intellectual background of certain post-colonial capitals, such as Brasília, nourished during the imperial epoch, but the material construction too had been put in motion by their respective empires, and their constructions would be later appropriated and usurped, not invented, by their successive nation-states. One shouldn't forget that empires bequeathed more than intellectually material projects, but also or forms and languages of representation to nation-states. For nation-states, also inherited the given empire specific practices of territorial and demographic engineering, and it was these very practices that buttressed their own capital projects, and to some extent national projects, right? Therefore, the study of the new capital cities in Brazil, Canada, and Kazakhstan in the 19th century, for instance, may assume a different scale once the cities themselves are seen not as self-contained projects, justified from within a national standpoint, but are instead placed in juxtaposition with one another, and thus seen as having been constituted in part by a series of strategies for inland territorial development undergirded by internal colonization. In pre-Confederation Canada, pre-revolutionary Brazil, and pre-independence Kazakhstan, capital cities were likely to be relocated. This we know. In the three cases, the appointment of the new sites of government was a symptom of shifting regional balances, or was dictated by the need to establish better control over unknown and underexplored territories. In the case of Ottawa, not only was its early development enabled by a British envoy, Colonel Bai, but its very designation as the seat of Canadian government was orchestrated by the Colonial Office on one side of the Atlantic and the Governor General of Canada in northern Governor General of Canada and Mun had on the other. Their very intense correspondence in the late 1950s and early 1960s proves this. Astana was founded, what is called now Astana, but then it had a different name, was founded in the 1830s as an outpost of the Russian Empire in northern Central Asia, as mentioned previously. After Astana, then called Tselenograd, became the forepost of Tselena, according to a couple of local historians, Andrei Dubitsky and Garifullah Yesim, Nikita Khrushchev suggested to transform Tselenograd into a capital city of the entire Kazakhstan in the early 1960s, or according to an alternative interpretation of its northern regions in the early 1960s. This didn't happen presumably because Khrushchev didn't have enough time to realize his intention. But I myself didn't find a proof to confirm or deny this. So I saw it in a few texts, but then I started to check it in the archives, and I wasn't able to do that. One of the reasons is that the minutes of Khrushchev's speeches are at times not, say, incomplete. So you have parts which are not there, or at least I wasn't able to confirm this information. Anyway, whether this is true or not, this project only became reality, the relocation project, the relocation of Astana only became reality after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the mid-1950s, the Making of Brasilia at first sight had nothing to do with an imperial agency. The official narrative informs us that the city was built from scratch by President Juscelino Kubitschek, who staked his presidential campaign in 1955 on promoting its construction. However, Brasilia's intellectual genealogy has much deeper roots than Kubitschek's campaign. We could see this, for instance. Obviously, there is a great deal of myth-making about this, but still. In fact, the ideological rationale to relocate the capital from Rio to the northwestern plateau had to a large extent crystallized in the 19th century, when Brazil was an empire, albeit independent from Portugal, since 1822. When Brazil became a republic in 1889, the newly adopted constitution included a provision about a new capital that ought to be located in the Central Plateau, and the Constitution of Brazil of 1890, the Article 3 states it plainly. The capital should be relocated. It can be checked. We thus have, during the 19th century, two capital cities that have been established by British and Russian empires in their former colonies, as well as an intellectual project for a new capital in the hinterland that would later take shape in Brazil. In all three cases, the appointment of the new capitals required the development of transportation, usually canals and railways, to connect the cities to the rest of the new cities to the rest of the country. The national highway, of which I have a splendid photo here. Yes, the national highway from Brasília to Belém and the Rideau Canal in Canada are typical examples to illustrate such developments. I also explored actually this parenthetically. I explored this issue concerning Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan had 4 capital cities relocation in the 20th century, and in one of the articles I managed to prove the link between transportation and the relocation of capitals. That's a different issue. That's a kind of it's a side project. Well, in the 19th century, my cases could be used as examples for some sort of centrifugal movement. By the mid-20th century, they evolved into stranglehold of a uniformity that ought to convey a message of coherent idea or representation of a national project. Brazil, Canada, and Kazakhstan, as part of the Soviet Union, used the spaces of their capital cities to promote modernization and social progress. Jacques Graber's Master Plan for Ottawa, Lucio Costa's Plano Piloto for Brasilia, which we saw today, and Grigory Gladstein's Plan for Tselinagrad. This one, the one you haven't seen yet, emerged between the late 1840s and the early 1940s. And all these plans emerged between the late 1940s and the early 1960s to showcase the modernist aspirations of Brazil, Canada, and Kazakhstan. These aspirations, however, produced exclusion, which became with time an essential feature of both public and private life in Astana, Brasília, and Ottawa. Indeed, one of the major concerns of my work has been to shed light on the dynamics of exclusion that was intrinsic to the construction of Astana, Brasília, and Ottawa as capital cities. After a decade of uncertainty concerning the location of the Canadian seat of government, the Parliament of Ottawa had been erected on an Indigenous people's territory, suggesting that future Canadian unity would be symbolically grounded on a trampled Aboriginal civilization. Further development of Ottawa had long been based on maintaining the symbolic dominance of Central Canada. Central Canada is Quebec and Ontario, who had been quarreling for centuries, while it largely ignored the interests and representations of Métis, Indigenous peoples, as well as the other Canadian provinces, the Joint Confederation after 1867. These are Canada West, the prairies, and Canada East, what was previously the different colonies of the Great Britain, like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, for instance. They are underrepresented in Ottawa. And today, if you walk in Ottawa, you can only see the statues or the representations of someone from Ontario or Quebec. And the rest of Canada are almost excluded, which is a great problem for a music historian, but also for other people who come, for instance, from Vancouver. The project of Brasilia, as already been mentioned, has a long and rich imperial genealogy. I argue that a profound continuity existed between the intellectual construct of Brasilia in the 19th century and its modernist realization in the 20th. Civilizing missions of various scope, selective treatment of classes, and silence surrounding women, Brazilians of African descent, and indigenous peoples were ideologies and practices that existed in the 19th century and that would be maintained by the Republican elites until at least the early 1960s. And this is absolutely pertinent in the historical documents that exist on this account. As for Astana, throughout its history, it had undergone several attempts to erase and rewrite its past anew. In the late 1950s, the Soviet leadership aspired to create a new class of Soviet Tseliniki in the city, a process that provoked the marginalization of the local population. 50 years later, Kazakhstan's post-Soviet president aspired to breed a new class of Kazakhstani elite, that time already based on a different criteria, by establishing a utopian ghetto on the left bank of the Yesil River, and preceded by the intentional disposal of Soviet artifacts of the territory of the existing cities. So it was the kind of the same process in the mirror. You can, on this map, you can see, for instance, so this is a map of Astana, which has now been renamed to Nur-Sultan, as you probably heard about this. I'm not going to talk about this tonight. I already wrote about this. It's not sufficiently historical to talk about. So this is a new part. So previously this didn't exist so no one lived here, and there was no construction and no buildings. So this is a new part of this. This is an older part of the city, and the Astana was planned according to the Soviet prescriptions of the late 1920s, right? So this is the railway, and this is the river, and the city was squeezed between the railway and the river. So this was Milutin's plan. And then the left bank was an idea or a concept that allowed the city to sprawl, to grow and to create a different identity. But the problem is that the identity that was created and the way it was created remained very, very exclusive. And now if you compare the consumption, the property price, the way people behave, you may notice the difference. And the difference is not the one that an urbanist would welcome. At least from what we consider now the most, the by the book, or the most the good examples, or the examples we like. I guess I could slowly go towards my conclusion. So we have time for a discussion. So now, what have been the results of my investigation, or this investigation that took me a few years to complete, and which is not completed yet? So the first result was to clarify and re-articulate the history of each discussed city through an entangled investigation of 3 cases. For each city, the juxtaposition with 2 other cases allowed their idiosyncrasies to become more obvious and more distinct. The aim was not to buttress any exceptionalist claims, so beloved by official history. Rather, through engaging perspectives from other cases, I attempted to question the narratives and patterns of historical perception that gradually became conventional and unproblematic. The second finding consisted in having achieved a more complex and systematic perspective on the role which capital cities played in the crystallization of the 3 states and their projects of rule that evolved from colonies to nation states in the 19th and 20th centuries. The entangled history of capitals as cities and the imperial/colonial/national history of the states that built and moved their seats of government has often been taken for granted or simply ignored, and this research hopefully would fill some of the gaps in that kind of historiography. The third outcome has to do with the examination of capital cities as a distinct object of inquiry in a transnational context. The cross-historical study of 3 cases arguably allows one to establish that the way capital cities had been fabricated and have evolved since the 1850s depended not only on the agency of the states that created them, but also relied on the existing templates of capitality that have been in circulation without clearly identifiable borders. In other words, apparently since at least the 1850s, no government had invented their capital cities anew. Most of them instead used part or present examples to justify their geographical and political choices. They borrowed architectural styles and design ideas from each other. This becomes particularly obvious when we analyze the master plans of capital cities in the 20th century. They do not look alike, but the resemblances in some decisions are drastic, let's say, and geographical choices as well, and political choices as well. So there is nothing more transnational than the invention of a nation state, as we know. So they borrowed architectural styles and design ideas from each other. They reconceived and recycled the elements of representations and instruments of legitimation that were invented in other contexts and for other occasions. All this makes one think that a modus operandi of the fabrication of capitals took shape since the 1850s and onwards, a modus that was later reproduced or referred to. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Большое спасибо. Не подумайте, что я узурпатор. Мне Юлия Александровна поручила вести дальше. Она была, так сказать, с подорожной по казенной надобности. Вот. Но, надо сказать, день у меня сегодня особенный. Я дважды удачно разминулся с кортежем нашего президента, вот выслушал лекцию, да, и тоже теперь думаю, что надо нам тоже построить новую столицу Вот. Лучше всего, наверное, в Бразилии или в Канаде. Так, вопросы, пожалуйста.
Чтобы она была не в Москве или как? А? Чтобы подальше от Москвы или...
Подальше от Петербурга. Пожалуйста, вопросы. Раз, Юрий.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation, particularly to me, because I'm interested in this issue from a perspective of historical urban sociology. And for me, I have quite an intellectual history also. And I have actually two questions. One is quite practical but important to me, and because my scientific supervisor, Professor Boris Комиссар, very famous historian in Brazil, he spent 5 years in Brazil, in Brasília, as capital city, and had experience to live in such a city, and had extensive discussions made about some meetings with him, and he told them us about his experience. He has shown several photos of this city, and I agree with you that you stressed this imperial genealogy of master plan and urban view of this city. But what concerns architectural representation, I remember that Professor Boris Комиссар told us that for the mayor, idea was exactly to maybe to implement a kind of communist utopian ideology into urban setting of this city, and Niemeyer stresses this. And so I think it might be important to stress also this aspect, how this urban landscape, urban cityscape expressed and to some extent stressed on population of the city, these utopian communist visions of Oscar Niemeyer, one of the key architects of the city. And my second question deals also with the problem of ideological representation. It concerns, of course, Astana, because I'm interested in Eurasianism. And I heard so much, and we know that President Nazarbayev, one of the key proponents and promoters of Eurasian ideas, I think has been since his famous lecture at Moscow State University in '94, when he actually embraced this idea and promoted it. So my question is, how did you find this representation of Eurasianism, any kind of, you understand, yes, in the architectural phase of Astana, now Nur-Sultan? Did you identify some features of this Eurasian architectural representation or not? It might be very interesting. Thank you. Very, very inspiring presentation.
Будем вопрос-ответ, да?
Я думаю, что так лучше, чтобы не теряться. Я могу на русском, да, ответить?
А можно на русском? Да.
Смотрите, во-первых, значит, там было... Начну с первого вопроса, чтобы по порядку было, да? Нужно немножко сделать пояснение, да, то есть, как бы, я должен сказать, в чем, как бы, мой интерес, да, начало. Большинство, ну, как бы подавляющее абсолютное большинство исследований о Бразилии, они касаются современной Бразилии, да, то есть города, который начинался, вот, ну, который начали строить в 56-м году, в 57-м году, да, был конкурс на мастер-план Бразилии. Вот. Когда я начал заниматься Бразилией, меня как бы, ну, уже в этом смысле там что-то трудно новое открыть, потому что это уже 10 раз все как бы уже открыли и обсудили. Вот. Меня интересовал именно аспект исторический, меня интересовала идея, интеллектуальная генеалогия Бразилии вот в 19 веке. И, как бы, и вот это для меня было как бы самым важным в моем исследовании. То есть я начал ходить по архивам и смотреть, а что вообще есть, вот с чего вот как бы, ну, как появилась эта идея, почему именно в это место решили принести столицу. И тогда я начал раскапывать слой за слоем, то есть получается, что периодически вот были моменты обсуждения этой идеи, потом она затухала, потом ее снова обсуждали, потом она как бы затухала, и как бы это часто бывает со столицами. С ним такое происходит, потому что когда столицу переносят в какое-то место, это никогда не происходит вот раз перенесли, нет. Всегда, как правило, есть какая-то генеалогия за этим. Вот. Просто у Бразилии это длилось 150 лет. Они обсуждали, потом не было денег, еще чего-то не было, было какое-то анти-лобби переноса, и в итоге перенесли, вот, потому что другие факторы тоже совпали. Вот. Я как бы в основном я работал над 19 веком, над интеллектуальной генеалогией, то есть я смотрел, что по этому поводу было сказано, сделано, как, где, и потом ко мне пришла идея уже через, наверное, год после этого связать вообще, в принципе, мне начало казаться, что идея столицы, особенно в 19 веке, она связана с идеей внутренней колонизации и вообще колонизации как бы внутренних территорий вот, в колониях или бывшими имперскими агентами. Вот, то есть это нужно пояснить. Теперь дальше. Насчет коммунизма. Три ключевых актора для строительства в Бразилии это были Бретен Кубичек, Оскар Немайер и Лусио Коста. Коста – это как бы дизайнер, он занимался градостроительством, Оскар Немайер был архитектором. Вот. Из этих троих коммунистом был только Немайер. Он официально состоял в коммунистической партии. Ни Коста, ни Кубичек коммунистами не были. Кубичек он вообще не был коммунистом. Он был скорее таким немножко левым популистом. Но в принципе он не был коммунистом. Вот. Коста он тоже никогда в принципе открыто себя коммунистом не называл. Вот. И у Коста такие вот в его дизайне Бразилии там в принципе коммунистического я бы сказал, что достаточно мало. Вот я там ничего не выжил. А Немайер он был...
Символы коллективизма.
Ну, как бы, да, но при этом я же показывал, да, что здесь как бы есть, когда человек планирует город и он строит разные входы для слуг и для господ, да, это трудно назвать коммунизмом. Когда он строит пространства достаточно эксклюзивные, то есть он планирует их, да. Немайер, конечно, был коммунистом, да, и у него есть, он потом приехал во Францию, потом его выгнали из Бразилии, потому что в Бразилии поменялось правительство, вот, он стал неугоден, его выгнали, он приехал во Францию, он построил здание коммунистической партии и так далее. Всегда у него были взгляды такие достаточно коммунистические, но при этом это не мешало ему очень хорошо работать на капиталистов, вот, и последние его проекты совершенно, они вызывают такое у меня смешанное чувство, потому что он, я не знаю, насколько он сохранил свою идентичность. Хотя, наверное, сохранил. В интервью 2006 года он говорил, что в мире осталось два последних коммуниста. Это я и Фидель Кастро.
Он тоже так.
Да? Вот.
Последний коммунист.
Да. Но я думаю, что утопизм тоже это... У него те пространства, которые он создавал, вот ранние его проекты для Бразилии, кинотеатр, вот они безумно, они очень креативные, они очень эстетически как бы привлекательные, и вот его ранние проекты, они действительно очень классные. А вот потом уже, к сожалению, он 20 лет он прожил вне Бразилии, вот, потому что его оттуда выгнали. Вот когда он вернулся, он уже был не тем человеком, мне кажется. То есть, в этом плане нужно разделять его творчество и его взгляды, мне кажется. То есть, эта стратегия изначально должна быть такая. Далее, по Астане. Есть доктрина как бы евразийства, евразионизма, неправильно, евразийства будет правильно, да? Есть Назарбаев, есть Астана, да? Как бы это Назарбаев толкал идею евразийства очень усиленно в конце 90-х, в начале 2000-х, да, потому что эта идея была ему... вообще в Казахстане был пантюркизм, потом ему на смену пришел евразионизм как официальная доктрина. Вот, в принципе, в какой-то мере она до сих пор присутствует, потому что вот евразийская интеграция, это можно как бы это отголосок еще тех вещей. Вот. А дальше второй вопрос. Насколько это отражается в архитектуре и в облике Астаны? Я думаю, что не сильно отражается. Потому что, когда мы строим город, когда мы планируем город, мы должны и планировать улицы, там, канализацию, пешеходные переходы и какие-то здания, да? И здания, в принципе, в которые инвестировало государство, в них не так много зданий, там, может быть, 5, 6, 7 зданий. И там, в принципе, все такое очень, либо такое дешевенькое, такое, как бы построить так, чтобы было функционально, и либо вот такие вот официальные, допустим, резиденция президента, она скорее в таком, я бы сказал, пантюркистском, таком неотюркистском стиле, с таким куполом. То есть там, вот сказать, что евразионизме очень трудно. И вообще, как можно в архитектуре изобразить евразийство, я не знаю. Вот, я не видел ни одного евразийского там небоскреба, допустим. Может быть, Газпром Тауэр – это евразийское что-то, вот, но в Астане такого нет. То есть Астана – это такой пастиш из вещей более вкусных, менее вкусных, более дешевых. А мастер-план 2 раза уже меняли, и там тоже его делал японец, вот, который, в принципе, сказал, что Астане нужен абстрактный модернизм. А что такое абстрактный модернизм, он не объяснил. А потом он умер. Вот такая история.
Ясно, спасибо. Диалоги Виктории не можем проследить.
Ну, как бы, может быть, кто-то сможет. Я просто, я в такой плоскости не рассматривал эту, я не ставил такой вопрос. Вот, но вообще под любую, архитектор под любую идею, если надо, может найти, ну, написать обоснование. Вот, вот.
You have three planned capitals, one in 19th century, 20th, and the other late 20th. But the three of them were built under different circumstances. Canada has been a democratic nation since its inception. Brasilia was built during a democratic period, but very early into its development, it came under a 21-year dictatorship in Brazil. And Astana, we could say at least it's under a hybrid regime, Kazakhstan. How do you see these different political settings affecting the development of these three cities?
Can I? Do you understand Russian, or should I maintain in English, or?
I prefer English. Sorry.
Okay. No, it's okay. So, well, the easiest and the wrong way to approach your question would be to say so we should start with defining democracy, right? Because you say Canada, I quote, Canada was a democratic state since its inception. But in Canada in 1860, major categories of people didn't have right for vote. Women didn't vote. Males who didn't have enough property couldn't vote. Métis and Aboriginal nations didn't vote, and until today in Canada, the First Nations, what they call Indians, they cannot vote. They don't have a vote right. So, if it's a democracy, then Canada was democratic since its inception. That's question number one. Question number two, if the sort of principle for comparison is to compare the regimes which have typologically have the same mode, let's say mode of rule, then Astana and Ottawa wouldn't be comparable, right? Because but that has never been my kind of point of departure. So because let's say if you start in the 19th century, you have a very, very complex picture, because there were very few, let's say, independent states de jure and de facto with similar systems, because you had empires, and then you had a great plethora of states which were half autonomous, where half of population or some segments of population had voting rights, with very different, very complex picture of, let's say, so. It's if you compare anything in the 19th century, it becomes very, very, like, you have to be very and earlier it becomes even more complicated. You can ask Mikhail Krom, who's sitting here. So he would. We recently discussed this issue, and then we agreed that it becomes like early in history it becomes even more problematic, right? To establish something which would be comparable, like, perfectly. So this was not my point of departure. Now, for instance, we can call Kazakhstan an authoritarian regime. We can call it a hybrid regime, right? But at the urban level, let's say, when we talk about the adoption of a master plan, the three master plans that I included into my comparison, which have been analyzed, they were selected through open competitions, through open calls, and there you can establish a criteria of, let's say, if it's by international call for projects, then you can compare how they are organized, who wins, and why. And I have a paper in Planning Perspectives which analyzes step by step how the call for Astana's master plan was organized, who won, why this person won, and what was the underlying political issues behind the call. Because the call is a sinecure, unfortunately. So that would be the answer, I guess.
So there are some persons who do not speak Russian, so it would be fair to use English as a common language. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry for being late, so that's why I missed probably the very beginning with the, I guess, the original idea of the conclusion, etc., etc. But you know, the president is here, and so that's the only explanation of these jams and
Okay.
Yeah, but still, the one idea that I really grasp is about using comparison and juxtaposing three capital cities. Could you possibly tell some details about that? For instance, Ottawa or Astana. What is the benefit of juxtaposing, comparing? What can you say new, for instance, about Astana or Ottawa or Brasília in the light of you know, the other two cities? Just one or two examples, just to show how it works. Yeah? Okay, and later probably can ask something. Another question.
Okay.
Please.
So, okay, if you want the concrete examples, the intention, for instance, if we take Ottawa, the intention really was, I think, the new idea was to shaken up the conventional narrative and the historiography, because the Canadian historiography perceives Ottawa as a result of a compromise. If you open any paper on Ottawa or any textbook on Ottawa in the Canadian, say, history, they would say Ottawa was chosen in the mid of the 19th century as a compromise between Quebec and Ontario. It wanted a capital city that would be located perfectly in the middle of two provinces, and that would represent a political compromise. And that was a result of many negotiations, and we got what we got. When I start to see the correspondence between Edmund Head, the governor of Canada, and the Colonial Office in the queue in the National Archives of London, I understand that the underlying intention between the Queen's choice was not at all about Canadian compromise. Queen Victoria didn't care about Canadian compromise at all. She was informed about it. But the main intention of Queen Victoria was to think about the territories to where Canada was expanding. Because Canada would become a dominion 10 years later. Canada would become ad mare usque ai mari, from sea to sea, from Atlantic to Pacific. So that was the political project of extending Canada. And that project would be to grasp the Aboriginal lands, for instance. It was based on misplacing the natives from let's say the territory of Ottawa to somewhere in the north, and that was the British political, let's say, intention. This can be found in the documents, and I hope I prove it, and I hope my paper to Canadian Historical Review will be accepted. It's now under review for some time already. So yeah, and so that's one of the examples. And the question is, how did I arrive to this, right? And I arrived to this through looking at other cases of capital cities that were relocated with the same intention, but formulated more clearly or visible from other sources. Because it's in this case, comparison changes your perception. So it's an epistemological kind of exercise, which is not always, and I perfectly understand the question in the sense that it's not always visible. The advantages of comparison are not a virtue per se. You have to sort of reconnect or show how it works make it always to explain it. Do you want me to provide another example, or is
Well, it's up to you.
okay? If we talk about Astana, for instance, in the case of my research for Astana, it has been for years. I have been a bit disgusted by the exceptionalist claims of the official discourse in Kazakhstan, because if you start to read what the official sort of narrative says about Astana as the how it is unique, and how we are so audacious, and how we are so capacious, and how we are so brave, and how we are so well done, then you start to think, what is so brave, and how much did you spend on it, and how much money was laundered on it, and how this was so not well done, but badly done. So it was kind of my rebellious feeling against the official discourse. And when you start to show other cases with other examples, with other data, with other numbers, and show that, look, you're not exceptional here, and here you're not exceptional either, and here it's so problematic, and here you're such a asshole, then this entire narrative can be sort of, I hope, if not totally excluded, but you can at least lessen it or ridicule it a bit. So there has been in the case of Astana, there has been a bit of emotional involvement into it on my side. In the case of Brasilia, as I already explained, this is I wanted a case in the mid-20th century. I wanted a case that would allow me to work on the imperial genealogy of a project. And Brasilia was a perfect case in the sense that 99% of the literature is about post-1956 Brasilia. But very few research, almost no research, is about 19th century Brasilia. Because in Brazil, no one cares about this. In Brazil, they won't talk about modernism. They talk about Lúcio Costa, Oscar Niemeyer, Marianne Peretti, so all this fancy stuff. But the rest, which was before, which is history, it's not. It doesn't bring immediate, say, political or career results. So they just don't really care. So in each of the cases, I can prove and show how comparison can become an advantage. Also, a disadvantage. It also has disadvantages, but an advantage as well.
Thank you for the presentation. I've got a question about Brasilia and this project. During your presentation, you quite a few times mentioned imperial and national history and the blur between these two concepts or projects like this. So my question is, can we find some traces of national project in Brazil? Because I can see quite some traces of nationalistic projects in Astana because of the issue with Russian immigrants, sovereignty and so on, and in Ottawa, where aborigines. Also, I believe that we could see imperial context in all of the cities as which could be described as progressist claims for some development of territory, and it's common for all three cities. But what about national context in Brazil? Because for me, Brazil was really about this, as you say, fancy stuff, modernism and Le Corbusier. Is it an exception in the discussion about these three cities?
Okay, so the national context in the case of Brasilia consisted in the fact that actually Brasilia by the mid say 20th century had accumulated a lot of structural problems, its inequalities, economic issues, because the key problem for Brazil by the time Kubitschek was elected was that there was a huge gap between the development, economic development, and cultural development or socio-political development in the south, in the southern regions, and in the north, because north was really underdeveloped, really poor, with major, let's say in some regions with major black population, black people. So Kubitschek's idea was to really build Brasilia and to unite the country, because parallel to the construction of Brasilia, there was a roadway, a highway, São Paulo to Belém, which would pass through Brasilia. So you see, so this is the map where you see it starts in the south, which has Brasilia in the middle, and which goes to Manaus and to Belém, to the north. So Brasilia was conceived as a point that would become a point of integration for various peoples. So the highway was built, so the people would pass through Brasilia if they would like to climb to the north or go to the south. So, and Brasilia was a project that would be look at this, which was conceived as a as a symbol of development. So we are able to build the new city. We are able to show to the urbe et orbi that we are modern, that we are capacious, that we can do it. And at the same time, it was thought as an instrument of modernization. Because when you start to build a city on such a scale, you import technologies, you import people who get money, so there are economic consequences, so there are lots of consequences for this. And there are parts of my dissertation which actually discuss this, how the public promotion events were created, how the loans were provided by various banks, how experts, Brazilian experts, were like working on this. So this was a vitrine, say the showcase of a sort of developmentalist, modernist kind of ideology, and this provided a very interesting example actually for Africa, for African countries, for other South American countries. This was very the echo of Brasilia was long-lasting actually, and it was national in the sense of integration of people. So it was national in the sense that, for instance, construction workers from the entire country would go there, and it would become a melting pot, for instance. So the other, but the kind of the point is that did it really work, and how did it work? Right?
Well, my general question would be about relocation of capitals.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's a norm, at least for the contemporary, modern age? And I know probably the two countries, France and England, where the capital was established in the Middle Ages and preserved the same spot, London and Paris. But all the other countries I can imagine, everywhere at some point the capital was moved, relocated even several times probably. So probably you can comment on this principle of relocating from time to time as a general idea. And more concrete question relates to Astana, Nur-Sultan. Probably I missed this point. Sorry if you mentioned this earlier. I mean some context of relocating the capital and what precisely was the official pretext of probably some ideas behind it. So, thank you.
Okay, so the general principle of relocation, this is an excellent question actually. So, okay, I won't touch it. So, general principle of relocation is yet to establish. I mean, it's one can say, okay, we have cases like Lisbon of 18th century. There was an earthquake and Lisbon was destroyed, right? It was destroyed, but no one decided to remove a capital city from Lisbon, right? So natural reasons, probably not. Political reasons, yes. So once we have a major political transformation, one would predict with a certain, I would bet like probably 40% at least, 40 to 50%, that capital city might be relocated. But on the other hand, we have the demise of the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, and then only one capital city was relocated, right? And we have we take former Yugoslavia, and again, it's so we pretty much have the same, like, so nothing changed in that sense also. So, but in Africa we have had quite a number of relocations in South America, not so many actually. So Brasilia. So Brazil. So I would say political transformation may evoke the relocations, but general trend is that capital cities become more stable with time. So since the 15th century, there is a clear identifiable pattern on the stabilization of capital cities. They become stable, they change rarely or quite rarely, and they because this is related for me in my view with the fact that the state apparatus becomes large. Now, when before you could just, if you like 10 centuries ago, if you wanted to move a capital city, you put the governor and then his office, and then he moves, and then and that's it. But now you have to move thousands and thousands, millions of people probably. Like in Washington, it's millions of people who work for the state, but millions, probably hundreds of thousands. Yeah, federal government. So it's not that easy. So that would take a lot of time and energy and money, and taxpayers would say, in democracies, taxpayers would say no, because it's too expensive. In authoritarian states, it's easier. And then again, because you have elites who may say, we're not sure. And then for Astana, now Nur-Sultan, the reasons were three basic reasons. Economic stagnation. So the idea of the government was to, through relocation, create economic possibilities and make the economy move, and this was a good reason. Actually, that worked. Second, the political sort of the lack of love of former president of Kazakhstan towards the ex-capital, the lack of sort of comfort in a certain sense. And then the third reason was the fact that Almaty as a city had very many infrastructural and urban problems. So, and it still has, these problems have not been solved. Same as in the case of Rio, for instance. Rio was also, one of the major reasons was that it's actually Rio is comparable to Almaty in this sense. Big cities, a lot of people, lack of space, bad condition, bad air. Let's move it somewhere else where we will just escape from this. But then 10, 15, 20 years later, the same situation occurs again, because capital city is a magnet, and then the same people go there and they start to do the same things, and then the ecology becomes, or the environment becomes as problematic as it was. Yeah.
Еще вопросы? Кто бы хотел что-то сказать? Опять переходим.
A few comments. Very interesting presentation. I'm completely in agreement with you what concerns this problem of comparative and also entangled treatment of these three capital cities. I think it might be very productive and very encouraging just to compare with the other cities. But from the point of view of intellectual history, I would like to say that exactly one of the key features of formation of new intellectual project, of new ideology, of establishment of new state and so on, new order, exactly embraced the idea of establishment of new capital city. Just one example is famous, it's from Russian intellectual history, is this Decembrist movement. One of the projects was exactly from Petersburg to central Russia to remove this capital city. And other project is Eurasian movement, also in correspondence, I found some Trubetsky and Savitsky, particularly economical geographer Savitsky, who used ideas of Mendeleev, who also promoted idea to removal of center of economic activity of Russian Empire to Tomsk, to Siberia, and Eurasians also wanted to establish a capital city on Volga River, not Siberia, but Volga River, a kind of meeting point of Europe and Asia. So in this case, it's only two examples, and of course, what concerns the late 20th century and this debate Hauptstadtfrage in Germany after this.
After the fall of the Berlin Wall.
This reunion of Germany, but I would like to say it was actually reintegration of GDR into Federal Republic of Germany. In this case, of course, the question just to escape this new imperial dimension, to preserve capital city, not so to remove actually, but to preserve in Bonn. Just to say that New Germany will not be a kind of new expanding superpower as it happened previously. And so in this case, but actually we have Berlin as a capital city of New Germany with some, but without any new fears, which we had some fears that Germany will be kind of new imperial power, but it doesn't happen.
Well, I totally agree. I use insights from obviously entangled history.
Is entangled in the sense of this, as you told us, these transactions, borrowings of projects, ideas. I understand. Concerning the projects on the Russian sort of capitality or this projects of removal, there is a scholar whom I read occasionally, Vadim Rosman. His name is Vadim Rosman. I think he lives in Moscow. He wrote recently. I think he wrote on the relocation of the capital to Novosibirsk. This project I know, but the other ones, the ones you mentioned, I don't know. But the discussions of this type, they emerge from time to time. So we can trace them. We can find them in many countries. The question is that most of them are sort of they not consequential, don't bring a result. Intellectual.
Yeah.
Just want to thank Harry for his presentation. And besides, it was a welcome presentation or welcome lecture. And I should say that Nari brings a new agenda to our department. And this is, of course, urban studies and also comparative perspective, which I personally really welcome. So thank you very much and welcome to our department. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. I'm very pleased that some of my students came. That was partially for you, because we're going to discuss this issue. And thank you for everyone who came. I'm very glad that someone is interested in what I do. Voila. Yeah.